Welcome to unit number 6 of our series, Finding God Through Faith and Reason. Again, we are working on chapter 2 of the book, New Proofs for the Existence of God, and trying to address this content to people who might want to be more edified in their faith, and even some people who might be struggling with their faith that you might know. What we're going to do now is we're going to bring some closure to this metaphysical proof for the existence of God. And we saw in episode number 1 and number 2 that there had to be at least one unconditioned reality. And then in our second episode concerned with the metaphysical proof, we saw that one unconditioned reality would have to be absolutely simple. And because absolutely simple, unrestricted, and one. We saw that it had to be absolutely simple because the unrestricted reality, kind of like St. Thomas Aquinas's unrestricted power or unrestricted acting power or pure acting power, we saw that the unconditioned reality really had to be so simple that it could be compatible with anything, any possible thing which could be dependent on it for its reality. And it also, of course, had to be even simpler than that. It has to be even compatible with itself. So for that reason, we saw that the unconditioned reality had to be at the top of the tree of being. We then noticed that because it was up at the top of the tree of being, that it had to be unrestricted. That is to say, absolute simplicity is unrestricted in the sense of having no restrictions or finitude or boundaries. We're speaking in the via negativa, the negative way. We can say what a thing is not, but we can't really say what it is, because if we lose it when we try to say what it is, because we'll put a restriction or a boundary on it. But we know it has no intrinsic or extrinsic boundaries because it is absolutely simple, because it does have to be compatible with every possible reality. Now, then, we saw that that meant it also had to be one and only one. Because, of course, if it's absolutely simple, if you postulate two absolute simplicities, right, there'd have to be something in one of the simplicities to make it, as it were, different from, or a different instance of, or a different instantiation of absolute simplicity than the first one. But whatever made it different, whatever made it a different instance, whatever made it a distinct instantiation of absolute simplicity, that couldn't be absolute simplicity. Because if it were absolute simplicity, then of course it would just be blended into the first act of absolute simplicity. All you'd have is undifferentiated absolute simplicity, which is one. But in point of fact, that's all you really do have. Because anytime you postulate a second absolute simplicity, it's going to be a fake. Anytime you postulate a second absolute simplicity, you'll always have to have something in it to differentiate it from the first one. And whatever it is that's differentiating it from the first one will be, of course, in some sense, not absolute simplicity. Therefore, it would have to be less simple than the first act of absolute simplicity, making it a fake absolute simplicity. So we see that then the unconditioned reality is one and only one. It is absolutely simple. It is absolutely unrestricted. That is to say, no intrinsic or extrinsic finitude or boundaries. And it is absolutely one. But St. Thomas goes further. St. Thomas says that this one being has to be the creator of all else that is. And not only the creator, but the continuous creator, if I might put it this way. The conserver, as it were, of all else that is. And the reason that St. Thomas says this is as follows. All we need to do is kind of go back to our very first unit. Let's just go back for a second to when we were talking about why there had to be at least one unconditioned reality. And remember when we were talking about that, we said, well, there were two things that we could have. We could have, in all reality, you could have an unconditioned reality which had either a conditioned reality which had a finite number of dependencies, or a conditioned reality that had an infinite number of conditions or dependencies. Now let's just kind of take that straightforwardly for a second, and let's split it out. We know that for any conditioned reality, we know one thing from the very beginning. We know that it could not have an infinite number of conditions. That's the one thing we know from the beginning. For any conditioned reality, say a cat or a proton or whatever you like, that proton could not be dependent on an infinite number of conditions being fulfilled, because those conditions would not be fulfilled, in which case that proton would never come into existence. Okay, so we know that. So X that option out. You couldn't have infinite dependence. And then we said, therefore, you'd have to have finite dependence. You'd have to have then our cat or our proton would have to be dependent on a finite number of conditions being fulfilled. But if it were dependent on a finite number of conditions being fulfilled, then you'd have to have a last or a terminating condition. And if you had a last or a terminating condition, you have two options. Your last or terminating condition, why, it could be another conditioned reality, or it could be the unconditioned reality. Now, we already know the solution to this problem because we already saw it in step one. We know that the terminating or final condition below the quark somewhere, we know that that terminating condition could not be a conditioned reality. Why? Because if it were a conditioned reality, it would be a conditioned reality whose conditions were not fulfilled. And if it were a conditioned reality whose conditions were not fulfilled, then it would be nothing. And everything dependent on it would be nothing too. So our cat has only one option. Our cat has to be dependent on a finite number of conditions, which means it has a final or last condition, and we know what that final or last condition must be. It must be an unconditioned reality. Now, in the second place, we know, because an unconditioned reality has to be absolutely simple, because it has to be compatible with every possible reality, and therefore could not have a boundary which could exclude it from any possible conditioned reality. Therefore, we know that that absolutely simple, which has to be unrestricted in the sense of no extrinsic or intrinsic boundaries, has to be absolutely one, and there can be therefore one and only one unconditioned reality, which must lie at the bottom of the finite number of conditions which every conditioned reality is dependent on. That one and only one unconditioned reality, all second unconditioned realities are fakes, because they'll have to have something in them to differentiate them from the first one, which would make them less than absolutely simple. Boom, just that plain. Now, that one unconditioned reality, just lying at the bottom then of that line, it has to lie. That one unconditioned reality, because there's only one in the set of all reality, that has to be then the unconditioned reality which grounds not just our hypothetical cat, it has to ground every single solitary thing in reality. It's really easy to see this. Why is that? It is so because, just take a look for a second here. Just think for a second, I've got the set of all reality. How many unconditioned realities do I have in the set of all reality? One and only one. Therefore, what else is everything else in reality? If I only have one unconditioned reality in the set of all reality, what then is the rest of the set of all reality? Has to be conditioned realities. Okay, let's just assemble the data now. So now I've got all these unconditioned realities out there. Everything in reality except the one unconditioned reality is a conditioned reality. Now I've got all these conditioned realities that constitute all of the rest of the set of all reality. And every one of those conditioned realities must be dependent upon a finite number of conditions, which means it has a terminating condition which ultimately fulfills its conditions. And that final terminating condition must be our one unconditioned reality, the only one that exists in the whole set of reality. Therefore, what can we say? We can say that the one unconditioned reality is the ultimate ground of the conditions for all the rest of reality. It is the ultimate ground of conditions for all conditioned realities. And since all reality is conditioned realities except the one and only one unconditioned reality, you can say, shorthand, that the one unconditioned reality is the ultimate ground, that is to say, the final terminating condition upon which every other conditioned reality, everything in the whole set of reality depends. So, we go then to St. Thomas Aquinas' contention that our one unconditioned reality, our one pure acting power, our one absolutely simple reality, our one unrestricted reality, not in the sense of an infinite plane or something, but in the sense of an acting power which has no intrinsic or extrinsic limits, restrictions, or boundaries, our one and only one unconditioned reality now must be the ultimate ground of the conditions of every single thing in reality except itself. Of course, we know the cause of itself is impossible, so it must be being itself. Now, what is another easy word for that? Creator. Yeah, the one unconditioned reality, since it's the ultimate ground of everything else that is, the one unconditioned reality, quite literally, has to be the creator of all else that is. Now, if you got that, then get this. St. Thomas goes even further. He notices that conditioned realities can never become unconditioned realities. Now, there's a proof for this, but it's a little complex, and I'm not going to give it to you today. But there is a simple way of seeing this. If you can only have one and only one unconditioned reality, that's all you can have, then no conditioned reality can ever become an unconditioned reality. No conditioned reality can ever, as it were, take care of its own existence or its being. The conditioned reality will always have to stay a conditioned reality, and therefore, if this conditioned reality is conditioned by time, that conditioned reality is going to be dependent upon the unconditioned reality at every single moment that it is. You see, what St. Thomas Aquinas is trying to say here is when the unconditioned reality is grounding, as it were, all conditioned realities. And by the way, it grounds, conditioned realities not by absorbing them into itself. These things are totally different, right? They're finite. They have finite boundaries. They're completely distinct from the unconditioned reality. No, the unconditioned reality is literally fulfilling their conditions. If I could use an analogy, the unconditioned reality is thinking them into existence. The unconditioned reality is thinking all conditioned realities into existence. I use the word thinking here in the sense of a mentative act, not something like a brain wave, not something like a content in my brain. I'm talking about a mentative act of absolute acting power, the mentative act of a pure, reflexive, simple act of existing. It's thinking the whole universe. No, it's thinking everything else that is into existence. But here's what Thomas is saying. Since no conditioned reality can become an unconditioned reality, then it must follow that the unconditioned reality must be fulfilling the conditions of every conditioned reality at every single solitary moment that it exists. And if God stops thinking about us, we're in trouble, everybody. If God stops thinking about us for one single moment, poof, I mean literally, we're nothing. If God stops fulfilling the conditions of our existence, and we are radically dependent, dangling participles, as Thomas Aquinas would put it, as, an ends, a mere ends, compared to God's essay, the infinitive of to be, right? If God should stop thinking about us for one moment, if the absolutely simple act should stop thinking about us for one moment, then, of course, we would become, in that moment, nothing. So we'll call this radical contingency for a moment. But make no mistake about it. Inasmuch as there can only be one unconditioned reality, and inasmuch as at least one unconditioned reality exists, then that one unconditioned reality must not only be the creator of all else that is, it must be the continuous conserver in existence, the continuous creator of all else that is, and God better not stop thinking about us, or we're gone. We are radically dependent, that radically dependent. Now let's see if we can kind of get a sense then for the whole metaphysical world that St. Thomas Aquinas and others since his time have really tried to conceive. Because in a way, we've been proving God's existence with these concepts, but these concepts are really ways of helping us to speak about God. See, when we talk about God as absolutely simple, we have to start using analogy, right? Because we can't conceive of an act of absolute simplicity. We can't conceive of a pure acting power without any intrinsic or extrinsic boundaries. Every time we try to positively conceive it, we lose it, we finitize it. So what do we have to do? We have to literally back off. We have to literally use the via negativa. We don't want to get into pantheism either. Because we don't want to be saying something like, well, gosh, every being is somehow absorbed in God, or that beings somehow constitute God, because they really don't. What is in fact happening is God is compatible with every single being, since he's absolutely simple. And that means he can think of everything in one huge mentative act. Right? He doesn't have to have separate mentative acts to think of each condition. One mentative act can think of a zillion conjoined but differentiated beings. So God in one mentative act, which is different from himself, different from his own nature, God in one mentative act can therefore think into existence all of the rest of reality. Everything in reality except himself, because he is. He doesn't have a cause. He is pure being. He is not a conditioned reality. He is an unconditioned reality and doesn't need a cause. Now, sometimes some of my students get kind of mixed up here, and they say, well, wait a minute now. If everything has to have a cause, then why doesn't God have to have a cause? Well, nobody said everything had to have a cause. The only thing metaphysicians throughout the centuries ever said was any conditioned reality would have to have its conditions fulfilled. And then they said that any conditioned reality would have to have its conditions fulfilled not by an infinite set of conditions, but it would have to be done by a finite set of conditions, which had a terminating condition, which terminating condition was an unconditioned reality. That's what they said. So nobody ever started with a proposition, everything has to have a cause. It'd be an idiotic presupposition. What they started with was, any conditioned reality must have its conditions fulfilled. The fulfillment of conditions has to have an unconditioned reality at the set of a series of conditions. That unconditioned reality itself has to be absolutely simple, because compatible with anything which could ever come into being. That absolutely simple reality would have to be unrestricted in the via negativa sense of no intrinsic or extrinsic boundaries, and that in turn would have to be absolutely one, because of course anything that would make a second one would immediately give rise to an instantiation which would be less than absolutely simple, which of course would make the second absolute simplicity a fake or an intrinsic contradiction. Now, that's what metaphysicians said. So what about God? Does God have to have? Of course not. Why? Because God is an unconditioned reality of which there can only be one. We started with conditioned realities need causes, as it were. Conditioned realities need their conditions fulfilled. But an unconditioned reality, by definition, does not need its conditions fulfilled. Now, if you take this metaphysical proof seriously, this is kind of interesting, isn't it? Because, of course, what did Thomas Aquinas just do? He proves right? And I'm kind of just doing a little bit of an update, with some contemporary language and some contemporary examples like electrons and protons and things. But technically, the proof is quite sound. What is being proven here is the following: that you need at least one unconditioned reality, that unconditioned reality must be absolutely simple, that an absolutely simple reality must be unrestricted or infinite in the sense of the via negativa, no intrinsic or extrinsic boundaries, and therefore it must be one. That is to say, one and only one, because any second would be a fake, which means that it would have to be the continuous creator of everything else that is. So says I, Thomas, other metaphysicians, therefore God must exist. If the definition of God here is an absolutely unique, unrestricted, that is to say infinite, an absolutely unique, infinite, continuous creator of all else that is, which is an unconditioned reality and absolute simplicity, then God as defined must exist. And the interesting thing is there's really only two ways out of this little pup. The first way out is you can deny that an unconditioned reality has to be absolutely simple, but then you're going to have to explain how it can be compatible with everything else that is. Or you can say that hypothesis F or hypothesis not F are true, that they can really exist in all reality. In other words, you can try and say that there doesn't have to be at least one unconditioned reality in all reality. But to be honest with you, if you try to have hypothesis F be true, since you're going to end up with the last condition whose conditions are not fulfilled, which is nothing, that means that you and everything else in the world can't exist. And if you're going to say that hypothesis not F is true, then you're going to say that something is dependent upon an infinite set of conditions to exist. And when you say that, guess what? That means it's dependent upon an unachievable number of conditions in order to exist, in which case, of course, you and everything else would be nothing. The real alternative, then, to getting out of this, is, frankly, well, to affirm the existence of an unconditioned, absolutely unique, unrestricted, continuous creator of all else that is, which is absolutely simple, namely God. One last thing. People might be a little bit curious. Might be curious about, well, what about the Trinity? I mean, if you can only have one God, if you can only have one infinite power, if you can only have one absolutely simple, pure, active being, if you can only have one absolutely simple, unrestricted reality, which means it must be compatible with everything so as not to be excluded by anything, so that it can be pure acting power, then if there's only one, what about the three persons in the Trinity? Well, we're going to be talking about this quite a bit in another unit, but for the time being, let's just say this. That, you remember when I was talking about self-consciousness? And I said you could be aware of your awareness, and you could even be aware of your self-awareness, that you could actually be aware right now that you were self-aware. And remember I said that if you could be aware of your self-awareness, you could almost have your own inner universe. You could, as it were, you could like have your own inner world. And there would be the outer world, and in here would be the inner world, which I constituted by my self-awareness, by my awareness of my self-awareness. And in a way, then, I have a privacy. I have, as it were, an independence. I have a kind of an autonomy in my own inner world juxtaposed to the outer world. And if that is the case, then, of course, I actually can have a self-consciousness which makes use of my power. Now, what I want you to just see for the time being is what we have proved is one infinite power. What we have proved is one absolutely simple acting power. What we have proven is one unconditioned, absolutely simple acting power. And now conceive of this. Conceive of three self-consciousnesses making use of that one infinite power. Three persons, which are like three self-consciousnesses, three self-awarenesses, making an unconditioned and unconditional use of that one infinite power source, that one unrestricted infinite power, so that they are using unconditioned that one infinite power. And what are they doing, as we'll see later? They are in love. And they are loving one another such that there is real interpersonal love taking place through these three self-awarenesses, making an unconditional use of the one infinite power source, the one infinite nature, the one infinite power of God. And that is the beauty of Christianity. It is the beauty of this proof. It is the beauty of absolute simplicity. It is the beauty of infinity. It is the beauty of the God which can be known through faith and reason.
Father Robert Levis and Father John Trujillo answer your emails in Web of Faith. Coming up next, here on EWTN.
I have come that they may have life and have it abundantly.
If we take a moment to notice the beauty all around us, we can then contemplate the divine artist who created that masterpiece. Father Thomas Dubé helps us to appreciate God's creation in his new series, Beauty Coming Alive.
The whole universe is charged with amazement, and we don't get amazed.
Beauty Coming Alive with Father Thomas Dubé, an all-new series here on the Global Catholic Network, EWTN.
This month, EWTN is offering the booklet, Our Lady of Fatima's Peace Plan from Heaven. Learn more about the Fatima story and the events revealing Our Lady's plan for peace in the world through families praying the Rosary. This booklet also lists important prayers and instructions on how to pray the Rosary and is available for a donation of $2. Write to EWTN, 5817 Old Leeds Road, Irondale, Alabama 35210. Remember to request the Our Lady of Fatima's Peace Plan from Heaven booklet with your donation.
Our Lady is revered as the Queen of Martyrs in England, land of faithful witnesses, St. John Wall and companions, Blessed Margaret Clitheroe, St. Thomas More, St. Edmund Campion. These and many more joined their sacrifices to the cross of Christ. But before they gave their lives for Christ, many of these martyrs traveled to Ladywell. Discover the faith that makes martyrs. Learn why devotion to Our Lady is one of the hallmarks of true disciples of Christ. Ladywell, Queen of Martyrs, a feature documentary only on the Global Catholic Network, EWTN.
The Holy Father's prayer intention for the month of May is that, like the Virgin Mary, all Christians may be guided by the Word of God and remain attentive to the signs of the Lord in their own lives. The mission intention for May is that in mission territories there may be good and enlightened teachers in the major seminaries and institutes of consecrated life.